that a little bit. And one thing in particular, one of my first things when I sat down and sort of think, what are we going to talk about, was this issue of art and activism and how quite a few of the practices that I saw in Glamfa in particular had this element of activism. I can think, of course, of Andrew, who I had a previous conversation with, and he sort of explained his history and activism. I, of course, think of Joanne's work in relation to Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was an early feminist, very coming from that activist moment of raising awareness. And even down, and of course, Micha and Elle, but even Eben with the use of materials coming, from sort of the landscape in that way. And so I was wondering if, maybe those of you that I mentioned or those of you I haven't could sort of talk about that, about how activism in particular has played a role in your practice, but also in your life, because I know that sort of becomes a border line in your life and for that sort of project. So I'm going to open it up to you guys if you have any sort of thoughts on that.
I forgot to mention in the beginning, I've written an essay for the Glamfa catalog, and so as a writer, I would like to say that I don't know what the word theory means. I think it's like words like nature or universal healthcare or sublime. I don't think when we say those words, we all sort of get it, but if you really put anybody on the spot, I don't know if those things are definable. And so I say I would be more inclined to approach it from an aspect that it's as writing is communication. Well, if you want to call certain types of writing theory, I think that is useful, but I'm afraid of it as a blanket, as something that sort of covers a whole genre of written works or a type of thinking about art that can be really dangerous and misleading. But I do believe that some of my best ideas have come from misinterpreting things that I've read, so that's sort of my relationship with theory. I don't know if anybody else has a strong relationship with theory and would like to kind of bounce around with that.
I think for me, theory has been a way to develop critical thinking skills. So if I try to read theory, which is really complicated and difficult, I'm building, my skills, and that helps me actually think through really complicated problems. And it helps me make art that tries to work through the same thing, really complicated problems, and make those problems accessible for other people as well. So I find theory gives me all sorts of food to work with in art making.
I guess I'll just contribute a little anecdote here. If anyone's heard this before, I'm sorry if I'm going to bore you with something you've heard already. But as I mentioned, when I first got involved in art making of any kind, it was at the time of ACT UP, where art and activism and theory wasn't really in the mix. People were just in the streets doing what they needed to do to make change, to save their lives. And it was quite a pivotal time, and all kinds of great art was made, and very significant images and symbols and videos and so on. Fast forward to last quarter, and I took a video art class at UC Irvine, and I covered the span of video art from the 50s and 60s onwards, and it touched on the era of AIDS and ACT UP. And it was the first time that I was in a class where my own experience was being discussed, kind of like I discussed World War II or World War I, and sat there and sort of digested what I was reading and pontificated about what it was and what it meant now. And people who were half my age, or maybe just a little older, were sort of talking about the sort of like the Lions in Grand Central Station and ACT UP New York, and things that I actually did and places that I actually was, and I felt so old and so irrelevant. I mean, it really felt as though a whole new generation was interpreting, packaging, concluding, summing up, consigning to history, defining it, fixing it right before my very eyes, and I'm like, I'm not dead yet, like I'm still here and still sort of feeding and fueling what I'm thinking about now. I'm not really sure where I'm going with that in terms of theory, but being in the program, the MFA program, has sort of been great in just sort of balancing out my own personal experience, and experience that is really touched by the sort of activism of the late 80s, mid-80s, early 90s, which sort of still informs what I do now. It's like I'm glad to be exposed to theory and theorists and texts and so on to sort of guide me a little bit, but it's almost secondary to sort of my more sort of instinctive impulses with what I'm doing now. Anyway, I thought I would share that anecdote that aged me so well.
Yes. Well, since you pointed at everything, I mean, I'm really generally interested in the kind of strategy of breaking down categories, partly because I got the idea from Dead French Guys, but also partly because it's what gets my panties wet, or I mean, what works with my life. And so, I mean, to me, really, like, recently I read this quote from Elle, who I'm not a fan of, saying that philosophy is action because it involves taking a stance, even if your stance is like breaking down other people's stances. And so really, I think that theory and activism are inseparable. That like ACT UP is such a brilliant example because I mean, ACT UP was like actively changing the definition of AIDS, like intervening in clinical trials for drugs, and like really engaging in like epistemological activity of like changing knowledge in general through their activism and being in the street. And I think that a lot of like street activism, it involves like an active practice, something like art, where it's like a kind of thinking, right? You have like an idea about what the world is and what politics are and whatnot, and so you go out and you try to change that, and then you come back and you're like, well, that didn't work. Or, well, how did that work? Or what worked, or whatnot. And so it's like this churning, this active process, right, of having ideas and trying them out. And similarly, I think that way about art, or about contemporary art at least, that I try to approach it as like a kind of thinking. Like, how can I start with this question, like how might I use online public space to update my ideas of political change, and then trying that out in some way and seeing if it works, or if it doesn't, or what works about it, or what doesn't.
I just wanted to clarify really quickly that I did not mean to sort of conflate the two, because I think that there are areas, I think of it sort of like a Venn diagram. Like we have areas of overlap, but they're not necessarily sort of one and the same. But they were both sort of things that I heard come up sort of across the table here. Did you want to add something, Ellie? No? Well, I can keep moving because I have a whole page.
My project, I found that women of a certain age were really eager to share a story about the book. So I started collecting these stories just as audio recordings. And I think because I've spent a lot of time with theory, certain things started to become very present for me. As I was collecting the stories, I became very much aware of the amount of mediation that was happening, both in my role as the interviewer and with the person telling me the story. I could see how the stories were being framed for me in a specific way, and that there were certain messages that people wanted to make sure they were putting forth. And I understood the power that I had as the receiver of these stories. And I also could see the power in narrative, and also maybe some of the problems with narrative as I was collecting these stories. So it was important to me. I don't think I would have had that level of understanding if I hadn't been really struggling to understand theory, you know, as I was working through my program. So it became a big part of the piece, was to sort of understand how to present narrative, how to present history, and make that, you know, sort of the essence of the piece.
I was just going to say something quickly about this idea of theory, object making. The way, as collaborators, well, for me anyway, the way I see